So the Yellow Vest protests here in France have had a lot of ups and downs so far. There was a very, very big explosive start. Police cars burned, like pseudo barricades erected, people stealing guns from police officers. There was a gradual die down as the momentum was lost, with occasional rises every so often when President Macron would screw up or do something provocative. Um, there's been a recent eruption after the fire at Notre Dame, after there was, I believe, somewhere in the ballpark of $1 billion raised by a number of billionaires for the reconstruction. And there's been a lot of anger directed at the fact that these billionaires now have just trundles of money to pass around to these projects, when they somehow didn't have them before. The main thrust of the protest has been by anti-banker, anti-rich sentiment, which has allowed it to bring together a lot of different ideologies, a lot of different wings of French people, but that also has a lot of caveats, which I can get into later if questions will allow. A lot of the country still is very much against Macron. His approval rating is somewhere in the ballpark of, I believe, 20%, in the low 20s. But when polling is done against candidates like Marine Le Pen, or even people like Mélenchon, um, Macron's polling becomes much higher. There is a sense that while there is a general disapproval of Macron as a very, very ineffectual leader, when compared to candidates that French people find even more disfavorable, his ratings go up. And in addition to that, while polling has been pretty consistent, at least up until now, when it's become a bit less disproportionate, around two-thirds of French people approve of the Yellow Vest protests themselves and the message behind them, but a larger percentage of that is against the violence that has been seen from some of the rioters who are called casseurs here. Um, but in regards to the polling, French media, there's a dichotomy. A lot of you could say, quote unquote, pro Macron media, like French public broadcasters or French state media, like France 24, for instance. There's a lot of, I don't want to say whitewashing, but there's a lot less emphasis on the messaging of the Yellow Vest protests. There's a lot less emphasis on the severe violence. It's kind of put as an outlier that is not given a ton of coverage in comparison to maybe more important topics like French lifestyle, or celebrity news, or international foreign news. Like not necessarily the things that are banal and uninteresting, but things that are not separate. Like there are other things that are going on. There were a couple instances of blatant censorship where the French public broadcaster, for instance, completely blocked out anti-Macron signs and images that they were using, but those are fairly rare. On the contrast, alternative networks like RT France or Sputnik France give tons and tons of coverage, arguably disproportionate coverage, to the Yellow Vest protests. There's live streams, there's interviews with all kinds of figureheads, constant rolling coverage. But as a result, there's not a ton of coverage. There's not a ton of anti-Yellow Vest coverage or giving any sort of semblance of attention to the other side. Not really. Um, there isn't really, not to say that the middle ground would be necessarily preferable, but there is really no middle ground when it comes to French media's response to the Yellow Vest protests at this time, especially as patience kind of wanes on it by a lot of French people. Um, yeah, that's a good question. There were initially some victories, especially after very, very violent nights of rioting. Macron um, walked back on the gas tax. raised the minimum wage slightly, but he did not go back on the main uniting factor of the protests, which is why they have continued to go on for so long, in that reinstating the wealth tax on the very, very wealthy. Um, I don't I don't consider Macron too stupid to live, but mainly because he's committed a lot of missteps in this, in continuing to let them go on, not recognizing demands of the people, even as he's going on this gigantic tour around the country to hear those opinions, which recently finished. But he understands that a movement that has so many sides to it and is consistently fought with one another um, will eventually eat itself, and that's what's going on at the current moment. There were a lot of it manifested itself in physical fights between communist members and fascist members. That's happened a couple times where there's this all-out brawls in the street. Other times it manifests itself in the communications realm. There was an event where some of the LFS combined to form an electoral list to run. There was polling that showed they had 13% in the polls, which is not unsubstantial for a European election. But as soon as that happened, there was a massive schism in between the anti-electoralist camps, the radical faction, and the more pragmatic side, who were made up of a lot of working class. There were like working class mothers, factory workers, these kinds of people who were trying to run. Death threats, um, just just all kinds of just anarchical actions to try to destroy this electoral faction. Their politics, the politics were pretty all over the place. It was very, very catch-all, the politics of the electoral list, but both fascists and anarchists on the electoral side attacked it for attempting to engage with the system itself, especially because there were considered to be undesirables in that list, because there were people who had voted for Macron in the first election and then had gone back on him. Um, there were people who, just weren't really hot on the idea of, for example, like using the guillotine on Macron. They were more interested in engaging with it and trying to ferment an actual solution. Um, but there are all these schisms that are happening. Um, Even though there are a lot of there's been a recent, as I said before, there's been a recent eruption in activity. There's been like lots of fires set, police officers attacked, that kind of thing. Even though this has happened before, as the people of Paris and the people of France as a whole are getting fed up with it just continuing. There's a chokehold on the metro system here. They're burning civilian cars. There was an incident that really turned people against them. I remember distinctly where they had burned a if I'm confusing these two buildings, forgive me. They had burned a restaurant that had been frequented by a lot of French elites, French political people. And while that was celebrated, the fire that was set in that building went up into the apartments above and caught fire in an apartment of a single mother and her child, who then had to be evacuated and were basically almost killed. Um, there doesn't seem to be any, because they don't have an effective leadership, because there are all these kinds of factions that don't know what they want as a final solution to what they want, what is wanted for France. Macron could just wait these people out. He really can, up until, because the next election is in, I believe, 2022. If the Yellow Vests want to continue doing this for the next 2 years, all of their support, I think, is going to evaporate. Macron is going to be able to implement what reforms he wants. Macron is going to be able to, if he chooses to run again, which I doubt he will, honestly, but if he chooses to run again, he may very well win if someone like Marine Le Pen again wins in the second round. As long as the LFS refuse to have a central leadership with a central goal and a central platform, there's going to be all of these people from all different sides trying to vie for it, and nothing is going to get done.